Okay, now that you've decided on a camera and a lens to buy, the next step is to decide which rig or stabilizer to buy to help give you some smooth movements. Now, depending on your film style will depend on what type of stabilizer you'll want to buy. So I'm going to be going over a few different rigs and stabilizers that I use and brands that I recommend buying. The first and most common stabilizer is a tripod. Tripods are good for shooting styles that have little or no movement. I personally like to have a lot of movement to my shooting style, so I don't use tripods that often, but for sit-down interviews like this or time lapses, they're absolutely necessary, so I would call this a crucial piece of gear for any filmmaker. The tripod that I own is the Manfrotto 055 legs with a 502 fluid head that cost me around $350 total, and that's about as cheap as I'd recommend going for a quality video tripod. And the reason is because a fluid head is a must if you plan on doing any type of tilting or panning and want those movements to be smooth. I also highly recommend the brand Manfrotto, as they are one of the most reliable companies out there for tripods, and their plates can be used on most gimbals, so you can quickly go from tripod to gimbal without changing any plates. Now, of course, you can get cheaper tripods, but essentially, the more you're willing to spend, the more fluid your pan and tilt movements are going to be. And I recently picked up an even nicer tripod that cost me almost $3,000 called the Satchler System FSB8 with Flowtech 75 legs. Basically, it's super light, goes really high, and is really easy to unlatch and adjust the leg height, and will give you insanely smooth shots. Moving on to the next stabilizer I recommend getting is a GlideCam or 3-axis gimbal. I have quite a few comparison videos showing the differences between these gimbals, so make sure to go check those out in the gear review section of the course. But the GlideCam is the stabilizer I use for 90% of the shooting that I do, as it allows me to get super smooth moving shots in almost any scenario. And yes, I do like it better than motorized gimbals, as it gives me a much more natural looking movement and is more versatile to be used in more situations. And the GlideCam that I recommend getting right now is the GlideCam HD Pro, which runs at $500 and will be able to fit on just about any camera from 0 to 10 pounds. But for a cheaper alternative, you can pick up a Flycam Red King for almost half the cost and will do almost as good of a job as the GlideCam. I still like GlideCam better, as it's slightly smoother among a few other things. Again, you can see the full comparison in the gear reviews, but for the price, the Flycam Red King is hard to pass up and probably the first stabilizer that I recommend you getting if you're on a budget, and that's about as cheap as I'd recommend going when buying a stabilizer. Any cheaper than that and your results are going to suffer. As for a 3-axis gimbal, my top recommendation right now is the DJI Ronin S that you can pick up for about $500 for the Essentials kit, which is the kit I recommend getting. And I've compared the Ronin S to other popular gimbals like the Zhiyun Crane 2 and the Crane 3, and I still like DJI better. But the times that I like to use my Ronin S over a GlideCam is when I'm getting perfectly straight push-in shots, like when I'm doing real estate, or if I'm filming out of a fast-moving vehicle or helicopter, then the motors really help absorb that bumpy movement. Or if it's really windy outside, wind will make glide camming really hard. Or if I'm shooting low to the ground shots, then again my gimbal is going to be able to give me a smoother shot than my glide cam. For pretty much every other type of shot, I prefer the glide cam, but for those scenarios, it's nice to have the Ronin S in my bag. Now, I also own a Freefly Movi M5 that I use for flying bigger cameras like the Red. Overall, I think the Movi M5 is the best motorized gimbal on the market right now, as it produces the smoothest shots I've seen out of any other motorized gimbals, but you will pay a lot more, and it does require two hands to operate, and it's quite a bit heavier and bulkier, so there are some drawbacks to that to be aware of. Keep in mind too that a glide cam or a fly cam is going to be much harder to learn than a motorized gimbal. The glide cam will take a few months to get the hang of, but once you do learn it, it will be a much more versatile tool than a motorized gimbal. But for quickly getting decently smooth shots, motorized gimbals will have a much shorter learning curve. Be aware though, it will still take some time dialing in the settings and getting used to the responsiveness of those motors, so it still takes a good amount of time to learn and practice no matter which one you invest in. Moving on to the next type of stabilizer I recommend getting is a shoulder rig. Shoulder rigs are great for documentary, narrative, or handheld shaky cam style filming like intense fight scenes. Now, I personally use my glide cam even for handheld style shooting, so I haven't found a need to get a nice expensive shoulder rig. However, I do own a cheaper shoulder rig called the Cowboy Rig Studio that costs around $25. That's about as cheap as it gets, and it does a great job for its intended purposes, so I highly recommend it for that handheld documentary style shooting. The next stabilizer I recommend getting is a slider. Sliders are most commonly used for slow, controlled side to side or front to back movements. I personally don't use slider shots very often, as once again, a lot of the shots I can get with a slider can similarly be achieved using my glide cam. Also, sliders are generally inconvenient and clunky to carry around, but the slider that I own and recommend is the Rhino Slider and Arc system that allows you to get perfectly smooth shots that have automated in and out points set, and you don't have to push it or anything, just watch it do all the the work, and full-time filmmaker members can get 10% off all Rhino sliders using coupon code FTF10. Again, I don't use mine a ton, but they are great for very specific slow-moving cinematic movements, as long as you're willing to carry around a lot more gear and have more time to set it all up. And my last stabilizer that I'll mention is a monopod. Using my Manfrotto fluid head, I recently bought a monopod that allows me to basically get a tripod shot for on-the-go situations where I don't have the space or time to spread out all 3 tripod legs. For example, when I was shooting wildlife on a safari in Kenya, I couldn't use a 3-axis gimbal because I was doing a lot of long lens zooming, and I couldn't use a tripod because we were in a Jeep the whole time, so there was no space to spread out the 3 tripod legs. So in order to still get smooth panning zoom lens shots, I put my Manfrotto fluid head on my Zero carbon fiber monopod, and I could quickly get tripod-like shots without the tripod. Now, I've personally tried cheaper monopods that I didn't like at all, so I recommend getting a nicer one like this. And this one's also super nice because the 3 little mini legs at the bottom are wide enough that it can actually stand up on its own and act as a freestanding tripod. Obviously, don't leave it unattended, but it is a nice perk that it can stand alone without you having to hold it up the whole time. So there you have it, guys. That's a look at a few different stabilizers that I use and recommend. You can quickly get out of control spending a lot of money with stabilizers, and like I mentioned, a lot of these tools I rarely use. So starting out, I'd say a tripod and a fly cam or glide cam is all you'll need to get going, and then add on new toys as you see a need, depending on what types of videos you find yourself shooting and what tools you need for those shoots. Keep in mind, there is no one tool that will do it all. As I always say, just different tools for different situations. But hopefully that helps you decide which tool is right for you. If you guys have any further questions, please let me know.